endlessly searching for an original sin.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sweet Pool. Now, here's a fun thing. I'll be returning to live streaming for my supporters, probably next week. In fact, we have a game that a supporter gave me to stream. We're going to keep the vampire stuff going, but I'll talk about that more during that stream. I'm an idiot. For now, let's jump back in. Let me make sure I got the right one. Yep. Sometimes it is hard to kind of figure it out. School was over, and with the cleaning duty finished, most of the students had gone home. Makoto was sitting with one elbow on his desk, sulking.
おー、怖っ。俺ら帰るけど、誠どうすんの？俺はいいよ。また明日な。おう。
His friends took no offense to his snippy tone. One by one, they filed out of the classroom. Alone, he heaved a loud, frustrated sigh. Yuji had put him in a bad mood. One afternoon assembly had ended. Makoto had suggested they take the train home together, but Yuji had blown him off with an excuse about doing an errand. He had a feeling he knew what this errand was. Yuji was going to Tetsuo's house. He didn't have any proof of this, of course. It was pure intuition. No, perhaps closer to paranoia. But from the way Tetsuo and Yuji had been acting lately, he couldn't think of any other possibility. On Monday, Yuji had been out sick. Kamiya had called Tetsuo over and given him a stack of worksheets. It could only have been homework for Yuji. Nobody else had been absent that day. After school, a friend invited him to hang out, but Makoto turned him down. Instead, he quietly trailed Tetsuo. He didn't know where Tetsuo lived, and he'd seen him on the train a few times in the past, so he knew it had to be in the same general direction as Yuji and himself. As he boarded the train, a damp stench tickled his nose. The cars were always so stuffy and miserable during the rainy season. The train pulled into his usual station, then departed a few minutes later. Yuji's station was the next one. Tetsuo was standing by the door. Makoto watched him from the next car. Arriving at the platform, the train slowed to a stop. The doors opened and a crowd of passengers deboarded, Tetsuo among them. Makoto's guess had been right on the money. Angry, he stepped off the train, taking care not to lose sight of Tetsuo. There could be no doubt. Tetsuo was headed to Yuji's house. But, even after confirming his suspicions, he wasn't done trailing Tetsuo just yet. He wanted to see this to the bitter end. It was then that he realized that the anger was getting the better of him. Makoto had never liked Tetsuo. He was too unapproachable, too opaque. Opaque? He was always alone and seemed to like it that way. Recently, however, he had started interacting with Yuji. As far as Makoto knew, this had come out of nowhere. Whatever the reason, it made him angry. He didn't want Tetsuo anywhere near Yuji. Yuji never tried to make friends with anyone. Maybe he was embarrassed about being the guy who got held back. To the rest of the class, he was the older kid with health issues, and everyone kept their distance from him. This just worried Makoto even more. It felt like if he didn't do something, Yuji would spend the rest of his school life as an outcast, or maybe drop out entirely. Although Yuji was rarely the one to initiate conversation, Makoto found him surprisingly easy to talk to. His absent-minded personality was something new. It made Makoto want to find out what was going on inside. Before he knew it, hanging out with Yuji had become the norm. At some point, he'd even started to believe that no one but him would ever be there for Yuji. He'd never questioned this belief, or wondered why he felt this way. Perhaps that was why he felt so nervous seeing Tetsuo and Yuji together. He was anxious about losing his place as Yuji's friend, something he'd previously taken for granted. Then he thought about it logically. He knew there was no harm in Tetsuo and Yuji. His rational mind understood, but the worry remained. He needed to keep those two apart. Makoto's own thoughts filled him with shame. He knew this attachment to Yuji wasn't healthy, but he just couldn't stop himself. Makoto continued to follow Tetsuo, keeping as much distance between them as possible. He held his umbrella down low to conceal his face. Up ahead, he could just make out the top of Tetsuo's plastic umbrella. He felt ridiculous. Why was he acting like such a stalker? Just then, Tetsuo entered Yuji's apartment complex. Makoto watched him go, suddenly overcome with a feeling of utter misery. Why had Kamiya asked Tetsuo? Makoto was the one who had always looked out for Yuji. Why hadn't Kamiya asked him? The dull patter of rain against his umbrella seemed to thunder in his ears. The next day after school, Tetsuo once again disembarked at Yuji's station. Although he'd had no reason to believe that Tetsuo would visit Yuji again, the need to make sure had overwhelmed him. Once his suspicions had been confirmed, fury and panic seized his heart. Why would Tetsuo go back to Yuji's house? Did Kamiya send him on another errand? Or did he have something else in mind? He jealous. Makoto sighed for the umpteenth time. And now Yuji was going to Tetsuo's house. Whatever. Exasperation, Makoto ran his hand through his hair. He contemplated another afternoon of spying, but thought better of it. He couldn't do that to Yuji. Come to think of it, Tetsuo wasn't the only problem lately. Zenya was dangerous too. But even after hearing about Zenya's driver hanging around outside his apartment, Yuji didn't seem to be taking it seriously. Why didn't Yuji open up to him? Couldn't he see how much Makoto cared? All Makoto wanted was to help. He just wanted Yuji to trust him. Why wasn't he good enough? Growling in frustration, Makoto ruffled his hair even harder. He felt so stupid, getting all depressed like this. Overcome with shame, he buried his face in his arms. In all of his life, he'd never felt like this before. For the time being, he needed to keep Tetsuo and Yuji from growing any closer. He needed Yuji to choose him. Of course, Makoto wanted Yuji for himself. A statement like that carried some serious implications, to be sure, but it was the most apt way to describe his feelings.
気持ち悪い、俺。ホモなんじゃねえの?
A wave of self-loathing washed over him. His forehead hit the desk with a thud, and he slowly closed his eyes. After school, Yuji caught the train to Tetsuo's house. It was, in fact, the same train he'd always rode home, only this time he would be getting off one step later. Gripping the handle above him, he swayed with the train and watched the scenery fly past the windows. The sky was dull gray, with only the faint outline of the setting sun peeking through. He was actually going through with this. Yuji was surprised to find himself more curious than afraid. He wasn't excited about having to talk to Tetsuo, of course, but this was a chance to see what he was like outside of school. Maybe he'd get a glimpse of something he wouldn't ordinarily. The train arrived at his usual stop. It felt strange not to be deboarding here. When the train began to move again, his nerves kicked in all at once. Minutes felt like hours. He started to wonder whether he'd missed the stop by accident. Then the conductor announced the next station as the train pulled into the platform. The doors opened and the passengers began to file off. Yuji joined them. The station was laid out much the same as Yuji's own, to be expected. Given that they're on the same line, he passed through the turnstiles and exited onto the street, then followed the map that Kamiya had given him. After about 10 minutes of walking, he arrived at an old Japanese-style house located in the middle of a residential neighborhood. The nameplate next to the intercom read Shiranuma. That was it, Tetsuo's home. Yuji took a deep breath to calm his racing heart. Exhaling slowly, he pressed the button to the intercom.
Hi.
A soft feminine voice rang out from the speaker.
崎山って言います。同じクラスの。
His nerves made him a little tongue-tied.
宿題のプリントを神谷先生に頼まれて。
ちょっと待っててね。
The speaker clicked off and the front door opened.
こんばんは。あらあら、どうも。哲夫の母です。
Standing there was an older woman who looked every bit as warm and friendly as she sounded. She had a sort of smile that would put anyone at ease. That said, she was quite a bit older than one would expect given Tetsuo's age. She could easily have passed for Tetsuo's grandmother.
わざわざごめんなさいね。ありがとう。
いえ。これを。
As he pulled out the worksheet from his book bag, the woman's smile broadened.
せっかくだから上がっていってくださいな。ちょうど夕飯の支度をしていたところなのよ。
いえ、でも。
わざわざ届けに来てくれたのに、このまま返してしまうのは申し訳ないわ。ね、ぜひ上がってちょうだい。
He hadn't planned on going inside, but he couldn't bring himself to reject her kind of offer.
それじゃあ、すみません。
遠慮せずにね。さ、どうぞ。
She opened the door wide and gestured for him to enter. Hesitantly, Yuji stepped over the threshold. Like the exterior, the interior of the house was decorated in traditional Japanese fashion. He could smell something faintly familiar, like a memory from his childhood. From the front door, the wood flooring extended along the hallway to the back.
廊下をまっすぐに行って、突き当たりが哲夫の部屋だから、どうぞ。お夕飯、すぐにできるから、待っててね。
Didn't mean to skip that. The woman smiled and disappeared into the living room. Part of him was still reluctant, but he couldn't turn back now. He headed down the hallway. The left side opened out into the garden, and the right side was lined with sliding doors. It recalled distant memories of his grandmother's house. He soon reached to the door at the end of the hall. He paused, wrestling with his thoughts. Should he really have come inside? Maybe he should have said to hell with the courtesy and gone home. After a moment of internal debate, he came to a decision. Ignoring the jackhammer pounding in his chest, he raised a sweaty hand and knocked. After a moment, Tetsuo poked his head out and froze. Yuji dropped his gaze to his shoes. He desperately wanted to disappear. His body was so tense, he felt like he might pass out.
なんで
Tetsuo mumbled under his breath. Unable to look at him, Yuji dug into his book bag and pulled out a worksheet.
これ、神谷から。
Tetsuo's gaze shifted to the papers. Yuji thrusted them into his hands, and his fingers closed around them.
それじゃあ。待てよ。
As Yuji turned to leave, Tetsuo called out, making him flinch.
中入れば。夕飯食ってけとか言われたんだろ。
Apparently, Tetsuo could guess what had happened at the front door. He went back inside to his room. Loath as Yuji was to obey, he knew he couldn't just stand there. Reluctantly, he stepped inside. It was a perfectly ordinary Japanese-style bedroom furnished with a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf, in a matching black. Nothing looked particularly out of the ordinary. It was actually a little surprising, considering Tetsuo gave off such alien vibes. If this were anyone else's room, Yuji wouldn't have thought twice about it. Tetsuo dropped his homework on his desk and sat down, then indicated the bed with his chin.
座れ。
Yuji did as instructed and sat gingerly on the black duvet. His body felt awkward and stiff, like a robot's. The anxiety was making him hyper-aware of every movement, right down to the twitching of his fingers. Tetsuo was still in his school uniform, minus the tie. Evidently, he hadn't changed clothes since this morning. Yuji dropped his gaze to his knees. The silence weighed on him like a ton of bricks. He considered making small talk, but didn't he come here for a reason? What was it? He was so nervous his mind was blank. Desperately, he searched for the answer. First, he was supposed to deliver the homework. Check. Second, that's right, he was supposed to find out if Tetsuo knew anything about his condition. Come to think of it, he had been wondering about the incident this morning too. Why had Tetsuo punched Zenya? What else did he want to ask? A memory flashed through his mind. Last Friday in the rain. His hands started to shake, so he clenched them in his lap. Why had Tetsuo done that to him? He wanted to know, but couldn't bring himself to ask. He only meant to gather his thoughts, but now his mind was full of awful memories. Forget it. I should go home. Just then Yuji looked up. His eyes met Tetsuo's. Awkwardly, he looked away. As usual, Tetsuo's stony gaze was impossible to read. What was Tetsuo feeling right now? The silence was unbearable. Yuji had never imagined how frustrating it could be to have such trouble reading a person's thoughts. He needed to leave. But just as he was about to stand up, there came a knock at the door.
ご飯よ。
It was the woman from earlier, Tetsuo's mother. Tetsuo stood up and headed for the door. Yuji had missed his chance to leave. After all, he couldn't just shove Tetsuo out of the way and make a break for it. At least the interruption had broken the tension. He felt a little calmer now. Maybe he should hang in there a little longer. Sighing to himself, Yuji followed Tetsuo out of the room. Oh,
よかったらおかわりしてちょうだいね。
that looks really fucking good, honestly. He entered the living room to find the dining table covered with steaming plates of food and bowls of miso soup. The sight was actually kind of heartwarming. He could easily see the care Tetsuo's mother had put into her cooking. Yuji could make a few simple dishes himself, but nothing too elaborate. This would be his first proper home-cooked meal since Erika had moved out. Every inch of the room radiated warmth. It was the perfect place for a family to gather. In other words, it was everything that his apartment wasn't.
そこ座ってちょうだい。
Yuji nodded and sat where she pointed. Tetsuo sat down next to him. Meanwhile, Tetsuo's mother bustled from the living room to the kitchen and back.
今日はね、たまたま休みをもらってたのよ。うちは共働きだから、いつもはもっと遅くなるんだけど。
Tetsuo's mother explained cheerfully as she placed bowls of white rice next to each plate. Yuji realized that the table was only set for 3. Tetsuo, his mother, and Yuji himself.
さあどうぞ、食べて。
Hesitantly, Yuji picked up his chopsticks. He hadn't been particularly hungry before, but the delicious smell quickly stimulated his appetite. He glanced out from the corner of his eye to find that Tetsuo had already started eating.
いただきます。
He picked up the bowl of miso soup and took a sip. The mellow, savory taste of the broth spread inside his mouth.
うまい。
Now I'm hungry. Tetsuo's mother beamed.
よかった。
Now that he'd started eating, his body naturally relaxed. Unsure what to try next, he looked over the table. His gaze landed on a serving dish full of stew. Another memory flashed through his mind, a plastic container full of stew spilling out of a bag outside of his front door. It looked an awful lot like the stew on the table. That said, most stews tended to look alike, so it was possible that he was wrong.
あ、よかったら煮物たくさん食べてちょうだい。
はい。いただきます。
いつも仕事で出かけてるせいもあってね。この子の友達って会ったことないのよ。だから今日はびっくりしちゃって。仕事がお休みの日で本当によかったわ。
Guilt welled up in Yuji's chest. They weren't really friends, but of course he couldn't tell that to her.
そういえば、今日も学校に行ったと思ったらすぐに帰ってきたからびっくりしてね。担任の先生からは上級生と揉めたって聞いたけど、だからね、あんまり人様に迷惑かけちゃダメだって言ったんですよ。
Tetsuo continued to eat in silence. Evidently, Kamiya hadn't given her all the details.
ごめんなさい。お名前、もう一度聞いてもいい？
崎山です。
崎山くん。よかったら、これからも哲夫と仲良くしてやってね。
はい。
He couldn't say no to a smile like that. A loving mother, warm food and a warm house. Tetsuo was still his unusually quiet, his usual quiet self, but somehow he seemed a little softer around the edges. Here the wall that always shielded him at school seemed little more than a translucent curtain. And yet, for some reason, Yuji sensed a hint of loneliness. Tetsuo had everything, and yet something didn't quite fit. Was it because Tetsuo wasn't talking? No, it wasn't unusual for people to quiet down in front of family. After all, with no need to keep up appearances, there's also no need to make small talk. No, the loneliness Yuji sensed was different. He couldn't put his finger on it. His chopsticks moved from plate to plate, but even as he enjoyed his first home-cooked meal in ages, the back of his mind he kept searching for the missing piece of the puzzle. So that's where we're gonna leave it. There we go. We just had a very lovely home-cooked meal with Mama Tetsuo. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I know this was a shorter one, but still enjoy it, guys. I will talk to you all next time. Once again, thank you all of you who have support. You're all so very awesome and keep me going. Thank you, guys. Bye.